Hello, my friend. Welcome back. So glad that you're here hanging out. I wanted to share with you a little bit about what I've been reading this morning from Habakkuk. That's a funny name and kind of a hard one to say. Habakkuk. I feel like I'm sneezing or coughing. Anyway, Habakkuk, chapter 3. Let me tell you what it's talking about how God's fury has come through and it's shaken and destroyed everything. People are stammering and stuttering and they're shaken in God's presence. I want to read you a little bit from that. I'm just going to read it to you. A prayer of the prophet Habakkuk. God, I've heard what our ancestors say about you, and I'm stopped in my tracks, down on my knees. Do among us what you did among them. Work among us as you worked among them. And as you bring judgment, as you surely must, remember mercy. God's on his way again, retracing the old salvation route. Coming up from the south through Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, skies are blazing with his splendor, his praises sounding through the earth, his cloud brightness like dawn, exploding, spreading. Forked lightning shooting from his hand, what power hidden in that fist. Plague marches before him, pestilence at his heels. He stops. He shakes earth. He looks around, nations tremble. The age-old mountains fall to pieces. Ancient hills collapse like a spent balloon. The paths God takes are older than the oldest mountains and hills. I saw everyone worried, in a panic. Old wilderness adversaries, Cushan and Midian, were terrified, hoping he wouldn't notice them. God, is it river you're angry at? Angry at old river? Were you raging at sea when you rode horse and chariot through to salvation? You unfurled your bow and let loose a volley of arrows. You split earth with rivers. Mountains saw what was coming. They twisted in pain. Floodwaters poured in. Ocean roared and reared huge waves. Sun and moon stopped in their tracks. Your flashing arrows stopped them. Your lightning strike spears impaled them. Angry, you stomped through earth. Furious, you crushed the godless nations. You are out to save your people, to save your specially chosen people. You beat the stuffing out of King Wicked, stripped him naked from head to toe, set his severed head on his own spear, and blew away his army. Scattered they were to the four winds, and ended up food for the sharks. You galloped through the sea on your horses, racing on the crest of the waves. When I heard it, my stomach did flips. I stammered and stuttered. My bones turned to water. I staggered and stumbled. I sit back and wait for doomsday to descend on our attackers. It sounds pretty terrible, right? Pretty awful. All this God with lightning in his fists. But listen how the author ends this terrible chapter. Though the cherry trees don't blossom and the strawberries don't ripen, though the apples are worm-eaten and the wheat fields stunted, though the sheep pens are sheepless and the cattle barns empty, I'm singing joyful praise to God. I'm turning cartwheels to my Savior God, counting on God's rule to prevail. I take heart and strength. I run like a deer. I feel like I'm the king of the mountain. It's from my granddaddy's old large print Message Bible. So you have this horrible chapter of how God is coming through and destroying everything. And yet, right there at the end, the cherry trees don't blossom. The apples are worm-eaten. The sheep are dead. The cows are gone. The wheat fields are stunted. And I count on God's rule to prevail. I praise you anyway. Well, why? And what is God's rule? And how do you keep praising God anyway? It feels a lot like reading the story of Job to me. And it reminds me of a point that I've heard Paul Young make countless times. So Paul Young wrote The Shack, which has sold 90 gazillion copies worldwide and had a movie made out of it. And he's an incredibly successful author. And I've heard Paul make this point several times at workshops and on my podcast and in conversation before, that he needed everything. He had everything he needed before The Shack ever sold a single copy. That if The Shack had been a total flop, if he'd only made those 10 or 15 Xeroxed copies and given them to friends and family, that would have been enough. Because he was already whole. He didn't need success to make him whole. He didn't need book sales and numbers and money and all of those things, the fame, the opportunities that come with it. He didn't need all those things because he was already whole. He'd already found his worth in Jesus. He'd already found his purpose, his meaning, wholeness in God. So I read this story from Habakkuk, and I see him emphasizing that if we are made whole with God, fame or famine don't really matter too much. If we are full of God, we have all that we need. If we're full of God, what does that mean? If we're full of God, well, God is love. If we're full of God's divine love, God's nature, if we have already been made in the image and likeness of God, and we are purposeful about cultivating that wholeness, we've already got everything we need. It makes me think about Satan in the desert tempting Jesus, and Jesus responding, "Man doesn't live by bread alone." And so I think that if we are filled up with that same spirit, that in seasons of desolation, disappointment, heartache, that we can continue to trust in God's rule. And what is God's rule? God's capital R rule. What is it? That he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. That God is the author, the creator, the breath giver of our faith, and that God will continue to perfect that faith until the very end. So what is faith? And how do you have faith in the middle of the now and not yet? My friend Sarah Robinson talks about Beautiful Between is the name of her blog, and living in the now and not yet. How do I have faith, trusting in these promises I feel like God's made me when none of them are coming true? Let's look at Hebrews 11. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he's dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so he didn't experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And it goes on talking about the faith of Noah, who built the ark, Abraham, who was called to a place, he was called to go to this place that he would later receive as his inheritance. We see Abraham going to sacrifice his son. All these people are living by faith, and they're still living by faith even when they die. They didn't receive the things they promised. Maybe they saw him from a distance and said, "Oh, I can see it just out there, just a few steps further." And they kept trusting that God would be faithful to complete what he started. It's not easy. I was reading in Psalm 37 this morning also. And it says, wait patiently for God. Psalm 37:34, wait patiently for God. Don't leave the path. Look, I've left the path or come really close. Calling myself an agnostic, nearly calling myself an atheist for a while. Because I had taken my eyes off of God and focused them on people. And people are always going to let us down. They're always going to disappoint us, piss us off, make us angry. They're never going to live up to the expectations that we have for them all the time. But God, the author, the perfecter of our faith, even when the sheep are gone, the cattle are gone, the cherry trees aren't blossoming, the strawberries aren't ripening, when everything seems to be falling completely apart, if we continue to fill ourselves up with the love of God that we see made evident in the life and the example of Jesus, we are already made whole. And all this stuff on the outside is just icing on the cake or a great big distraction. Keep your eye on the healthy soul. Psalm 37:37. Keep your eye on the healthy soul. Scrutinize the straight life. There's a future in strenuous wholeness. So this video today is just to encourage you to hold on to God, to not leave the path, to be intentional about finding wholeness in yourself and in God, and not in any of these other things, because heaven and earth will pass away. Last night was Ash Wednesday, and I have never been more clearly reminded of how all of this is going to end. We are all going to die. And so in the same breath, none of this matters and all of this matters. But all of this matters because what I mean is we matter. People matter. Conversations and loving our enemies and forgiving every chance we can and loving people right where they are and being present with people in heartache and finding wholeness that can only truly come from God. Those are the things that matter. So don't leave the path.